Hi, I'm Dr. Meghan Davis. I'm an associate professor of environmental health and engineering. And when I was a PhD student, I was a learner fellow with the Center for a Livable Future and have maintained my relationship with the center ever since. I also now direct the Johns Hopkins Poe Center, which is a total worker health center in mental health. H5N1 is a strain of avian influenza that is highly pathogenic to birds. Hence, it's also called highly pathogenic avian influenza, or HPAI. Some people call it bird flu. What we're concerned about is that it's now been identified in dairy cows, which is unusual. Dairy cows can get influenza, but they typically get an influenza B or an influenza D. And H5N1 is an influenza A. And while this rarely has been reported in dairy cows and other cattle in the past, what we're seeing now is unprecedented in terms of the outbreak. What we think about with highly pathogenic avian influenza is typically been wild bird populations and poultry. What we know about avian influenzas is that they typically have a reservoir in waterfowl. So you think about ducks and other birds that, may be migrating from place to place. What we see in terms of spillover out of these wild animal bird reservoirs is that it often happens in places where there's water. So there may be a pond or a lake, and this can include ponds that might be on farms. And this is part of how we can see the spread into our domestic poultry. What's been really unusual about H5N1 is how often it has spilled over into mammal populations. With dairy cows, we're not 100% sure how it was spread, although the working theory is that the birds got into the barns and were able to interact with the feed, and therefore, once the animals consumed the feed, they were exposed. But there could also have been direct contact or other routes of transmission. What you have to recognize about dairy production, especially in the United States, but you'll see this in other parts of the world as well, is that on some of these larger farms, there are no walls to the barns. They consist of a roof and open sides, and alleys where the cows may move, and then stanchions where the cows can go lay down, as well as feeding stations. And what this means is that there's really nothing to prevent the birds from coming into these locations. The cows are getting infected, especially in their mammary glands, and this is why there is a lot of virus in the milk. And so it's thought that perhaps the milking machines themselves might be one route of cow-to-cow transmission. One of the things that we're most concerned about with H5N1, and in particular this clade that has been causing a global epizootic, that's a pandemic for animals, is that we keep seeing it jump into mammals. Any virus that can cause a lot of disease and spread in wild animal populations that can also infect mammals automatically is of higher concern for us because of the potential that it may become much larger in the human population. So if this particular virus should continue to change and adapt in a way that would allow for greater either cow-to-cow spread with more disease, or worse, that it's able to get into people and transmit from person to person, then we could be looking at another epidemic or pandemic. We don't know yet what will happen down the road. But what we do recognize is that given that we've shown some cracks in the response system in the United States, this is the perfect dress rehearsal for us to begin to address those weaknesses and really deepen the investment that we have in One Health efforts to control diseases at the human-animal interface. Industrial food animal production is larger scale agriculture, larger scale farms that are usually devoted to a single species in very large numbers. You can see this in poultry, you can see this in swine or hog production, and of course in dairy. Some of the largest dairies may have thousands of cows. I've been on 3,000 and 5,000 cow dairy farms, and there are even larger mega farms that might be spread across multiple facilities. What distinguishes an industrial scale or industrial food animal production level is that the wastes, including the manure that might go into a manure lagoon, far exceed the ability of the land to accept the nutrients. So it's not like you can just spread it on your own farm and it's contained within the farm itself. Many of these have to be spread off-site or at lands at some distance that either may be owned by the farmer or where there may be an agreement for the farmer to spread the nutrients. When you have 3,000 cows on a farm or more, you have a lot of cows. So when you introduce a virus to which the cows do not have immunity, since cows haven't seen H5N1 before this outbreak, you may have very rapid spread because you have a lot of contact among very large numbers of cows. And so something that might be a little more contained on a smaller farm may grow to much larger proportions on an industrial scale facility. These manures, we don't yet know if they could potentially harbor infectious virus. So that is an area where more research is needed because a lot of times with dairy cows, there are components of the manure that are liquid and may actually be sprayed onto farms, causing some of these to drift in the air. And so if there are crops that might be consumed raw or fruits that might be consumed raw in proximity, they could become contaminated with the manure. And if that could harbor infectious virus, that would be a concern. I'm not saying that we know that that is the case, but we know it is true for some bacterial pathogens, and so it's worth taking a look. Our workers on the front lines of this outbreak include those farmers who are working directly with the dairy cows and all of their employees who may be doing sick cow work. They may actually be working directly with the cows for a lot of different things that a veterinarian might do. They will be milking the cows, and that means they have contact with the milk that we recognize may be highly infectious. And in fact, the case that we have in humans of H5N1 was someone who worked on a positive dairy farm. In addition, we can't discount that there are many people who come onto a farm who are not necessarily the workers or the milker. You also have the milk itself, which we recognize in raw state is infectious. And so the milk haulers and then the dairy processing plants that take the milk and pasteurize it could be at risk. Further, we're still trying to understand if some cattle may be affected, given that we know dairy cows can be. And so that means that slaughterhouse workers could also be at risk. And so if we think about these are the workers who may be the sentinels for exposure that turns into disease. And so if they're sick and they don't have good access to healthcare, what does that mean in terms of the ability of our surveillance system to understand that there's a problem and then direct them to not only the healthcare services they need, but access to antiviral drugs or any other therapies? One of the most important things that has come out of this outbreak is it reveals some of the cracks in our system in terms of surveillance and response. The fact that the dairy industry does not have a lot of experience with high-path avian flu has shown that there are some gaps in what we are able to do in terms of federal oversight and also in terms of the partnerships between the federal, state, and local authorities, and also across the different agencies at all levels. And so when you have agencies that are siloed, and also agencies like the United States Department of Agriculture that has a dual mandate. It has a mandate not only to protect the animal health and the commodities that are needed, but also to promote agriculture and to market it. And when these two missions are in harmony, I think it can work well. But we've also seen that these two missions can be in conflict. So it may be needed to improve the regulatory authority and coordination, either through the Centers for Disease Control's One Health Office, or potentially by standing up a different authority whose job it is to really promote animal health. And to do so not just within livestock, but to do so across all animal species, given that we have extensive deaths within wild animal populations, and we also are threatening animals outside of our livestock populations. So coordination of response should be improved, and using One Health efforts to do so will help to make sure that all the different kinds of expertise that needs to be brought to the table is done so.